Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Sarah Preston. I'm based out of Organic, Alberta, but I'm the Prairie Regional Coordinator for the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian seed security, and we're a program of SeedChange. So we're very happy to have you all joining us today for this webinar on quality testing for marketing organic and specialty grains. I guess I'll be facilitating today, and then I have our Quebec Regional Coordinator, Hugo Martorell, who will be here helping out as well. And he has very generously agreed to share slides, which will be great. And I just wanted to take a minute before we get started to pause and acknowledge the lands that we all call home. So Hugo, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we're gathering virtually today, and from coast to coast, we want to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Indigenous peoples who call this land home. And we recognize that their longstanding relationship with the land, which precedes the establishment of Canada, and is still affected by ongoing racism of colonialism, ongoing violence of racism and colonialism and capitalism. And by living here and working here and using the resources in this place, we realize that we're now participating in this experience. So as part of our process to try and be accountable to our role in this ongoing violence, we invite you to join us in reflecting on how the seeds that we grow and eat could help us take accountability and learn to live and work and farm as better treaty people. We also encourage you to learn the history of the land that you're in relationship with by visiting whoseland or nativeland.ca, and Hugo will pop those into the chat if you're interested. So I wanted to just give you a bit of info on today's topic for context before we get into presentations. So at the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian seed security, we work to create more resilient seed systems. So we do that in partnership with organizations and farmers from across Canada. And we focus on increasing the diversity of seed available to organic and regenerative and ecological farms. Today, we're talking about testing to evaluate different end-use qualities in specialty grains. And many of the farmers that we work with have identified this as kind of a knowledge gap where more information could help them increase market opportunities for farmer-bred and heritage grains especially. Now that's important because developing markets for specialty grains is a key piece of the puzzle of seed sovereignty and food security and climate resilience. And the way that Canada's seed regulations are set up right now means that crops like these, which are from unregistered varieties, cannot be sold through licensed grain elevators, which often makes it harder for farmers to diversify their crops. Yet agrobiodiversity is a really crucial part of our food system's resilience, especially for organic, regenerative, and ecological farmers. So in the absence of synthetic fertilizers and herbicides, seed that's bred for low input systems becomes incredibly valuable as a tool for organic producers. And there's a strong need for more organic varieties because there's relatively few that are commercially available already. So projects like the Bauta Initiative's past participatory plant breeding project can offer much needed advancements because it empowers farmers to collaborate with researchers and then select new cultivars on farm so that they're super well adapted to their conditions or their practices. But lots of farmers hear about this and they're excited about it, but then they need to know that there's a market for those grains. And the processors on the other side need to know that if they're working with a newer or more diverse crop like this, that it will have the characteristics that meet what their customers want or what their processing systems require. And we've got quite a neat mix of people registered today. So we're excited to see folks from all these different pieces of the value chain here and to bring you together. Hopefully you'll all come away from this day with some tips on how end-use quality testing can help you better understand the grains that you are working with or diversify the ones that you could add. So today, this category of analytics that we're looking at, which end-use quality testing, is different from seed quality testing or food safety testing, which are a bit more familiar, because this one is about measuring the characteristics or qualities of a grain, specifically to see how it might behave in different end uses. So it's typically only used by plant breeders, but there are some cases where it can be a useful tool for farmers and processors as well. For example, when folks are working with adapting a new cultivar or anything that has much higher genetic variation, so like heritage grains, land races, population, or variety mixtures. Plant breeders tend to maybe do this kind of analysis on a new batch of crosses very early in the process, so well before it would reach the registration trials. And it can help them see whether a potential variety has the new traits that they're looking for, or project which market class it might fit into, or make decisions on which traits to prioritize. So for farmers like Ward Middleton and Chris Wooding, who we'll hear from today, and who were part of our participatory plant breeding program and have continued to develop their own unique cultivars to this day, this kind of testing serves a similar function as it would for a plant breeder, and it also can help them as a communication tool to collaborate with buyers. Our discussion will be focused on wheat, but many of these tests can be done on other grains as well. And we also wanted to clarify that end-use testing is certainly not necessary or required, but it can be a really useful tool for those who are working with these kinds of materials and markets and when it makes sense on their operations. So for a bit of a frame of reference, the sample sizes required are usually less than a kilogram, often 250 to 500 grams. And pricing typically starts around $25 in fees for a single indicator, all the way up to around $750 to $950 for a more comprehensive analysis. There are a few labs in Canada that offer these analytics, and we'll share a slide at the end with those, the list of that for those who are interested. So we have some really good speakers lined up today with Robert Beauchemin, Michelle Dang, Ward Middleton, and Chris Wooding. I want to give a big thank you to each of them for sharing their knowledge with us. We'll hear from Robert and Michelle first, and then we'll get the farmer's side of things from Ward and Chris. So I'll introduce Robert and then hand it over to him. Robert Beauchemin is a Quebec-based entrepreneur and agri-food leader with 40 years of experience in the grain trade. After growing his first wheat crop in 1978, Robert contributed to the establishment of the first organic certification program in Canada. Robert founded La Milanaise, North America's largest organic flour producer, which now supplies some 250 bakers and artisans across both sides of the border, as well as the retail market. Their new mill, which opened in 2017 in southern Quebec, includes modern lab technology to test grain quality. So those are some of the results that we'll be looking at today. And I'll hand it over to Robert now.
Hugo asked me to share with you some key elements of our milling operations, but I'm going to share with you a few slides of the operation as such. But I guess I really want to focus on assessment of grain and flour quality. So if you don't mind, I'll try to put this on here. Okay, Milanaise, I started farming in 1976, 77. Back to the family farm, built a small mill on the top right corner, and you see how we've progressed from the early 80s to the 90s to 2016. And on the bottom right corner is our latest addition. It's construction is just about finished. We're installing some equipment, so we're just adding more capacity to our present facilities. Um, we're we've been in organic production since the beginning, dedicated. One of our plant is dealing with transition farming because we could see the value added for farmers who are into this transition period, but also helping them on the agronomy side. So we're milling ingredients that are simple, healthy, and organic, and we're moving our products to bakers, food manufacturers, and to all enjoy cooking. We do manage about 5% of our sales are going into retail, directly retail, but we're dealing also with a club size business like Costco and other ventures in the US. About 50% of our business is into food manufacturing. Um, we are obviously focused on clean label, certified organic, and our grain supply is under supervision. We try to avoid just buying on spot from grain traders. There's a market for this, but we're trying to avoid it so that we can schedule and plan and work more directly with the farmers. So heading into more of a partnership with farmers and bakers. And we've have quite a strong innovation culture in our agronomy, milling, and baking technology. So we're also here looking at long-term commitments from either side, from the farming community to the baking community. We have a capacity present. We're milling about 80,000 tons, so it's about 3 million bushels a year. And we have quite a flexibility with the operations as such. All our capacity is quite automated. I'm not sure if you go as visited our plant, but there's very little personnel. There's very little bag handling where everything is robotic and managing about 6 million bags packaged flour and 20 million retail size bags. And we also have private label programs with different vendors, mostly in the States and here in Canada also. We're a lot of our programs are so working on trying to promoting organic farming is assisting farmers in the transition from conventional to organic. A lot of our programs here, agronomy is trying to facilitate the transition here in Eastern Canada. In Western Canada, we're arm's length distance, but now we have a field agent that will be doing some of this work also. Do a lot of variety testing. I see that Julianne is on the call, so we've done some work with CETAB, with Serum, with different research facilities, Université Laval, and a lot of soil research also. So our goal here is also trying to find a balance between farmers' requirement for yield and quality assessment. Usually, when the protein quality increases, the yields go down. So we try to find a convenient equilibrium between what the bakers are looking for and what the farmers need to grow in terms of financial requirements. So as I mentioned, our R&D program is from the agronomy onto the baking scene. And this is probably where we're trying to build this community of farmers and millers all the way down to the bakers and consumers. We're certified by just about everybody. We're running out of packaging area to put all the labels on, but that's in either market. And here is probably where I want to step into how we assess the quality samples that we receive from the farmers. We start with near infrared, where we take a pretty good assessment of moisture, protein percentage, Zeleny index, so that we have a pretty start-up idea with a quick text, 60-second text, and hardness index. We've added hardness to our testing protocols because in the last year, we've identified some critical information on the relationship of hardness to how we're going to mill, the ash content in the flour, how to monitor, and how to better do the tempering to control the starch damage. So also test weight will give us a fairly good idea of how many kilograms of flour per ton of wheat. We're usually trying to stay anywhere above 75, 76 kilograms per hectoliter. But the grains that we're receiving from out west usually has a higher test weight than in Eastern Canada. Here in Quebec and Ontario, we see some 76, 78, while in Western Canada, we see a lot of 80, 81, 82. So we're getting fairly higher extraction rates. We monitor for falling number. I'm not sure how people here understand what falling number is, but we're measuring the amylasic activity in the grain plant. And if I can just come back to the basic nature of a wheat kernel, is, des is designed not to produce flour. It's designed to produce another plant. So in that natural process, the wheat kernel is composed of a germ and an energy reserve, the albumen, which is wraps up in aileron and pericarp. So it's the when a grain, a kernel goes into the soil, within the first hours, if there's adequate moisture, we will see amylase activity. Amylase is the enzymes that will start processing the starches to have them develop into primitive sugars so that they could feed the germ while in the first 4 or 5 days of growth, because the root system has not the ability to start feeding the plant. So the germ has to feed itself on the starches. So the enzyme that facilitates the release of sugars is the alpha amylase. When a grain is sprouted, if you have left the grain out a little too long, certain varieties of wheat will sprout quite rapidly. What we measure here is the activity of the enzymes. We want to control this process in the mixing bowl rather than out there in the field. If the albumin, if the starches have started to be processed into sugars at the farm level, we have very little control of how it will behave into the mixing bowl of the baker. So to measure this, it's simply putting a certain amount of flour into a test tube, adding water to it, and putting it into how do you say bain-marie? Into boiling water, and shaking the content of the water with the flour. If the enzyme is not active, the starches will develop like when you mix flour and water, it will develop a strong gel. So if the enzyme is not active, we will see the plunger will take a lot of time to drop. It can take up to 350 seconds, 460 seconds. While if the enzyme is active, if sprouting has been initiated at the field or in storage, the plunger will release itself quite rapidly. It will be down into 60 seconds. So the goal here in measuring the falling number is to make sure that it is higher than 250 seconds. If it is higher, we can bring it back to a comfortable level. For most bakers is between 250 and 300 seconds by adding a malted barley flour. We also monitor for mycotoxins, probably this is mostly an issue in Eastern Canada and Maritimes, Quebec and Ontario, but we did see some Fusarium and Don in Manitoba. I'm not sure how what has happened in Saskatchewan and Alberta is probably less prevalent because you have a drier season, but probably in certain areas, if you get this hot night temperatures, when the plant is flowering, there is a risk of Fusarium attack. And we also perform on the wheat samples a glutopeak, which assesses the quality of the gluten. I'll get back to you on this, giving you a little bit more. Once we have a picture of the quality of the milling wheat, we finalize and we do all these tests to all truckloads that come in. We have a database for all incoming loads of grain that controls about 20 factors like a glutopeak will give us about six or seven different characteristics. So we put this all in our database, and the database of the wheats that we have in stock from the different recipes that are required by our clients. We will do some blending of wheat or blending of the end product of flour according to the quality of the wheat that came in. Once the wheat is milled, we will redo some testing, but going into more profound assessment, well, we'll start again with the near infrared to monitor the moisture of the flour, monitor also protein content to see if our blending was adequate, and ash content. Ash content is a measure of the purity of the flour. Ash is, we're talking ash, but it's mostly an assessment of minerals. And minerals in a wheat kernel are mostly in the outer surfaces. The bran and the middlings is where I would say about 95% of the mineral content is into these zones. So when we are producing white flour, we want to remove all the external the bran and the middlings, so that we have just the starches from the internal part of the kernel. So when we're measuring ash, we're basically trying to measure the cleanliness of the flour. On a white flour, we're looking at ash content of about 0.5%, 0.6%. In a whole wheat flour, it'll go up to about 1.30, 1.50% ash content or mineral content. After doing near infrared, we will do a farinograph. And farinograph, here again, well, we'll do the glutopeak because it's quite more rapid. The glutopeak is a testing method where we're monitoring the quality of the gluten itself. And gluten is a protein structure network, and it's composed of glutenins, which are long and heavy proteins that combine to form the gluten network. Within the glutenin network, gliadins are small globular proteins that intercross to limit glutenin bonds, reducing the resistance of the network. So what we're monitoring through a glutopeak is how the dough will behave in terms of softness of the dough, elasticity. If I could give you a picture of gluten, if you have, let's say, you go to a party and you're blowing balloons, you have some balloons that will require a lot of pressure to develop a smaller balloon, while you have other where a small amount of pressure will develop a very large volume. So the glutopeak will give you an assessment of the elasticity of the texture of the gluten itself. So it gives you a fairly good assessment of the ratio of gliadin and glutenin. Glutenins are genetically based and glutenin are environmentally based. So from one field to another, from one season to another, with the same variety, you can have a different glutenin to gliadin ratio. So you will have a dough that can perform very differently. So it has to be assessed on a lot by lot basis. And this is what we will do by using the glutopeak. So we're monitoring elasticity, softness of the dough, and the fermentation tolerance. Is this gluten, will it tolerate a 20-hour fermentation? Will it how will behave into very long sourdough fermentation, or is it a more nervous dough that will develop quite rapidly in an hour and a half, and then will release itself because it does not have the ability to hold its structure. So this is what we're going to be measuring on the GlutoPeak. The farinograph, what we're monitoring is the water absorption capacity and the gluten mixing tolerance. So here again, if a typical flour on a specific wheat will have 60% absorption water, it means that for 1 kilogram of flour, the farinogram will say it will take about 600 milliliters of water that it can hold and develop its tolerance. For the baker, the farinograph is just an indicator. Usually bakers will take the farinograph number and add on 12 points, 15 points. So it gives a fairly good idea on the amount of water that a specific wheat can absorb to develop a standard softness of the dough. After monitoring the water absorption capacity that will give us a gluten mixing tolerance, we will then pass on to an extensograph, which measures the development energy, but also how the dough will behave after mixing, an hour of fermentation after mixing, and 3 hours after mixing. So we can see how the gluten will hold during the fermentation and gives us a fairly good idea if we're directing this flour to the proper baker's need. We can adjust the extensograph by blending different flours that have different characteristics. And we also have the following number. After doing all these tests, obviously, we still do bake tests because numbers don't say everything. In French, we say c'est le four qui parle, it's the oven that speaks. And this is the final assessment of all the data that we've gathered in the assessment of the flour. How does it hold and how does it perform? So when we're shipping flour to a certain distance, we avoid then the baker saying, the flour doesn't work, so we can just show him pictures of following the baker's protocol. This is how it performed, and the quality was right on par. So basically, that's how we assess. All these equipments will give us quite a few different curves. Farinograph curves, as I was mentioning, will give us the amount of water the optimum amount of water that a flour can absorb. And for a baker here, this information, having a flour that will absorb more, can mean that from a 20-kilogram bag of flour, if the water absorption is quite higher, he can probably get 3, 4, 5 more baguettes than usual. So it's the water absorption capacity is quite important. The stability is also giving information on the farinograph is how the gluten will perform during the mixing. How long can it be mixed before breaking down? The next curve on the GlutoPing here again gives us an assessment of the softness and the elasticity of the dough. How much pressure and energy is required to develop its full volume. So, and the extensograph here again compares the energy required at different stages of fermentation. These are all quite technical issues. I'm not sure that farmers can relate to all of this, but it gives you an idea. If I go back to this previous quality assessment, we're trying to extrapolate from these basic testing how it will perform in the flour. So the best indication, quick reaction is obviously hardness index and Zillany index. We've added hardness index because we sort of observed in the past year that there's a protein other than gliadin and glutenin, pure indolines, a protein that it plays a key role in the hardness and the grain sizing by coating the starch, the granule starches. Glutenins can't bind to granules coated with puroendolins, which act as a lubricant. So this is for us. We were able to see the correlation of hardness to the amount of puroendolin content, and it gives us further indication on how we can temper and optimize the milling from a certain quality of wheat. There's usually, other than low falling number and mycotoxins, we usually can manage just about any way as long as we have a very good reading of how it's performing and how to blend it. So we have developed adequate algorithms here to blend in very different kinds of wheat. Some of the difficulties that we have is in certain years where the wheat is way too strong, and then we have to scout out to have varieties of wheat or crops that will bring more softness to the dough, to have a quality throughout the year, throughout from one season to another, that will be stable and that the bakers can relate to. So it's a very tough exercise in monitoring the crops. Once we have the relationship with farmers, that we have samples coming in the fall so that we can assess a certain mapping of what quality is where and how we can bring it in to blend it on a fairly consistent basis. The worst, bakers can get used to quite a diverse quality as long as there's stability from one production lot to another. The worst thing for a baker is having a surprise in every bag. So we try to monitor this by assessing the quality at the crop, mapping it out, and trying to pull into our production schemes wheats from different areas so that we can blend in and come in with a more stable product for our baking clients. It's about where I can lead you to now. Our a local field agent is Frank Manders. He's in Rogden, Saskatchewan, and you can probably get a hold of him by email or phone number. Did I confuse everybody?
That was very illuminating. Thank you, Robert. That's a lot of different indicators to learn and very useful. We've got a couple minutes. Does anybody have a question for Robert?
I do have two quick questions. With whatever lab that we're sending it to that would have the capability to test falling number, I would presume that they also have the option for us to ask them, can you test for the Zeleny as well?
Normally, most near infrared technology has a calibration for Zeleny. And as far as falling number, we've seen very little issues with falling number from grains out in the prairies. The only time is when it's over maturing. But then again, this is mostly a problem from Eastern Canada. Out west, we're used to seeing very high falling numbers. In the conventional market, most farmers are being told usually that their grain is borderline at 300 seconds, whereas we're used to doing blending wheat at 250 seconds. It could easily be brought into a production lot. I'm surprised that do they do standard falling number testing in lab facilities in the prairies?
Usually it's I send it to Winnipeg to Central Labs,
Yeah.
or there is now SGS Labs as somebody who I use here in Alberta. It
Okay.
was more difficult. It was only certain labs that would do it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, probably because it was much less of an issue than in East, but I see in Manitoba they can have some sprouting issues, and as far as climatic changes, I think we have to be ready for just about any scenario now of freak weather patterns that can bring in either downpours in July and August that can impact falling number.
Mhm.
So one last question. I know Sarah's looking at her watch, but as far as the wheat that myself and if I understand Chris Wooding as well, we've retained some of the wheat that was partway through its 10 years of selections. I have the one of the varieties that I've saved back was really only 6 years into what I understand would be 10 years of new varietal development because I wanted to maintain that genetic diversity. Um, but legally, I can't sell it into the fungible food system. I couldn't haul that to my local grain elevator because it is not a registered variety. So my question to you is, can your company, can your company purchase these grains if I grew at large enough scale where it can be identity preserved right to your door?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
You see, CFIA has this requirement of being registered if it goes onto an open market.
I see. Okay.
But if you're into a closed market, you can avoid registration.
All right. I'll touch a little bit more on my concerns around this in my turn in the presentation, but thank you for that.
Excellent questions, Ward. Thank you, Robert, for answering those. Um, so that does mean that on that list of labs who can do some of these tests, there are a few in the prairies who can do falling number. That should imply that they might be able to do Zeleny as well then.
Yeah, I assume because it's a calibration that comes quite standard on and usually grain brokers who are on a national or international market, Zeleny is always a requirement.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah, anything less than 25 on the Zeleny index could be borderline for baking, but it could be used to if it's between 20 and 25, it could be useful to cut down the extra strength on higher quality wheat. So there is a market for it. We usually have problems finding lower quality wheat. That's why we're doing a lot in Quebec.
That's interesting.
In fact, we've had this discussion with Hugo and Julian where we were trying to increase the yields here. So trying to focus, don't look at higher protein. We can get very high quality protein out west. We need some milling wheat that with that we can blend in to control the elasticity.
Okay. Yeah, so being able to blend from different regions and batches is quite
Exactly,
good.
exactly.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Robert.
Okay.
We were maybe wondering if you have any advice for bakers and farmers who are selling or buying grain directly with wheat grown from heritage, PPB, or variety mixed seeds.
Um, Basic stuff. Falling number, near infrared. Zeleny is a very good indicator for for a miller. I'm not sure how bakers can react to this, but having a stable Zeleny will give you a fairly good idea of the quality, the initial quality.
Okay, very good to know. Thank you. Thank you very much for taking the time with us. So Michelle Dang will be our next speaker. She's our research coordinator at the Bauta Initiative. She has been planting culturally significant crops and saving seeds in her family's backyards for as long as she can remember. And this experience inspired her to pursue a master's of science in molecular science with a specialty in botany at Toronto Metropolitan University, while also working at urban farms throughout her degree. And she's really passionate about finding ways that researchers can actually support farmers in making agriculture more farmer-led, ecological, and sustainable. And she has been very instrumental in helping oversee these tests of the PPB wheat. So I'll hand it over to you, Michelle.
Cool. Thanks for the introduction, Sarah. So today I'm going to be talking about how we can address the question of why you should quality test your wheat. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Michelle. I'm the research coordinator here at the Bauta Initiative. And you may be asking yourself as a farmer, what value can you get out of wheat quality testing? Or on the other end, if you're on the baker or miller side, what value can you get out of buying quality tested specialty wheat? So there are a lot of benefits, and I'm going to be talking about some of them today. So like Sarah mentioned in her introduction, the Bauta Initiative works with a lot of growers who work with PPB, heritage, or other grain mixes. And a lot of them, because they're unregistered, they face a lot of barriers to being commercialized in the larger grain system, whether that be through the broker or elevator or any open market. And so this can prevent a lot of farmers we work with who work with diversified grains or want to work with diversified grains from continuing down that pathway. And because it's so hard for them to commercialize, they may not want to continue working with it or scaling up those specialty grains to a larger scale. And to address this gap, the Bauta Initiative ran a couple of projects and initiatives to learn more about the market out there and how we can support growers who are working with specialty grains. So the first thing we did was a value chain assessment across Canada, which was led by a master's student named Murray Jowett. And this diagram is kind of complicated, but the main aspect of the diagram that we want to focus on today is this center red circle here. And this diagram represents, our national flow of grains throughout the country. And this red circle represents when we surveyed the growers that we worked with who are working with specialty grains, the area that they had the most success in being able to commercialize their grains through was through small and medium scale millers, bakers, and other like artisan markets, as they could sell directly to those markets without needing to go through a grain elevator or broker system. And so they were able to get around that grain registration barrier. And so this presented a new opportunity for a lot of different growers to try to reach out to artisan outlets so that they could work together to commercialize their specialty grains. And there were a lot of different benefits that growers we worked with mentioned in being able to work with these artisan outlets. And the first that a lot of growers mentioned was that they could do business together with these outlets that was more personal and value aligned, because more often they didn't have to work with larger scale or corporate buyers. And this relationship allowed for a lot more collaboration in the growing and breeding process, because you have that reciprocal relationship where you can give each other feedback on how your grain performed in a baking setting or in a cooking setting. And because you're working together, the various people you're working with to commercialize your grain could help you deprioritize yield in the breeding process, which, Robert mentioned, but also that gives you the space to potentially breed your grains for other things like flavor or a unique color. And this gives you a lot of flexibility and uniqueness in what you can breed your grains for and how you can market that once that goes through a miller or a baker. And collaboratively, you with whatever outlet you're working with, you can work to market that specialty grain in a unique way that allows you to sell your grain at a premium because it has a unique story behind it. And I'm saying all these benefits, but there still is a lot of risk that growers take on when they work with specialty grains, because they may not be able to speak to how well it performs for customers. But also from a baker or milling side, you may worry about buying an unregistered grain because you don't know how it performs against registered varieties. And so this is kind of where the quality testing aspect comes in. So what is wheat quality testing? A quick definition is just that it's a series of physiological and chemical tests that tell you the different characteristics and properties of your grain and how well that grain, once it's milled or turned into a dough, how it will behave when it's used for different purposes like milling, cooking, or baking. And it's a great way to get a common and standardized language that you can communicate to from a grower or to a miller or to a baker so that you can speak to how well it would perform. And so the benefit of quality testing your wheat is that you get an overall status of how well your grain performs once it's milled, but also it provides you exact areas of strength and weakness in your grains and how your grains may work for one purpose better than another. And another thing that works well or quality testing lends to is the breeding process. You can see how well your wheat performs to a registered commercialized variety, as registered wheat variety quality tests are available online. So you can do that point of comparison. But also, you can see how well your wheat is doing compared to some sort of breeding goal that you're trying to reach. And it will tell you how far you've gone in the breeding process, whether you think the wheat is ready for, commercialization or if it still needs work. And the last thing that I mentioned before is that the result of your wheat quality test provides you with data that you can communicate to millers or bakers or whatever outlet you're working with so that you can speak to what it works well to. And that way you can find a potential buyer who likes the quality of whatever specialty grain you're working with, which can make it easier to market or sell. So here's an example of a wheat quality result panel. You don't really need to know what any of this means. We'll be sending out the slides after this presentation, but I just wanted to highlight examples of how when you look at a wheat quality testing result panel, you can, quickly see areas of strength and weakness. So I'll say, for example, sample B here, which is highlighted in pink, it has too high of a humidity in the kernels, which indicates that if you leave your grain however it is, it might lead to mycotoxin development. So you should, one, air out your grain, and two, potentially move where it's stored so that it is drier to maintain better moisture levels. So that's kind of like an agronomic storage side to how wheat quality testing results could be useful. Or from a more baking side, for example, sample D, which is this yellow falling number right here, is on the lower side. And like Robert said, something with a low fall number often ferments more rapidly, but may have trouble sustaining that over a longer period of time. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but coming from a baker side, if a grower is able to communicate that to you, you can adjust your baking process to accommodate for that. And as another area of how we were able to support growers with wheat quality testing and commercializing their specialty grains, we were able to provide wheat quality tests for different growers that we work with. And here are like some of the results that we were able to find. And so we received 24 samples of wheat from growers, with samples being split up into registered, heritage, and PPV varieties. And we had Robert look at all our samples and kind of like give a little quick rating to each of the samples that he received. And based on what his review, the great thing is that when you break down each category of wheat by what type they are, the PPB and the heritage wheats have the same proportion of typical or high quality grains as the registered varieties. So this shows a lot of promise in that farmer-bred varieties can perform equally as well as registered varieties. And everything I'm kind of mentioning here is available to read through and learn more in the wheat quality testing interpretation sheet that Hugo and Sarah likely sent out before this. But yeah, this is also available on the Bauta website if any of you are interested. And I just want to emphasize there's a lot of numbers in wheat quality testing, but sometimes it's useful not to focus too much on numbers. We really emphasize making time to talk with farmers and millers and bakers and just different people in the value chain about what specialty wheats you're working with, because they can tell you a lot in a conversation on how your wheat will perform outside of the numbers on a wheat quality test. And yeah, so that's it for me. All in all, I just want to say very clearly, and what Sarah said in the beginning, wheat quality testing isn't necessary, but it's a great tool if you want to diversify the grains you're working with, breed your own grains, potentially diversify your value chains, and better understand how your grain could perform in different end use perspectives. And that is it for me. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. Excellent slides. And we can for sure send this out to everybody who's registered. That means Ward is up next. I'll give you a quick intro to Ward. He and his wife, Joanne Middleton, manage an 800-acre farm near Morinville, Alberta. They've been certified organic since 1998. And they've been developing their own wheat cultivar for several years now. And then in 2020, supply chain disruptions pushed them to get creative, and they started direct marketing more of their grains. And then today, they're largely direct marketing and working closely with local bakers. So over to you, Ward.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. And my starting slide was a picture of me doing wheat selections back in, I think, 2016 on the trials that I was doing for the PPB program. Next slide. And just for reference, because I know that all of you can probably find Edmonton on a map, this is the little red star just north of Edmonton is where I'm located in north central Alberta. Next slide. So for starters, here's the very humble first step of any assessment of our grains that we do. This is just sitting to my right in my office on the high quality furniture that you can see that I maintain. But it's a simple Labtronics conductivity moisture tester and a little lab scale and a certified volume measure, so we can do our own test weight and moisture. And most of that from the farm perspective is just making sure that we are going to be storing our grain in our granaries long term at a moisture that is low enough that, according to the Canadian Grain Commission, it will store long term. And so, just from a quality storage standpoint, we need to make sure that we have at least a certain moisture and temperature going into the bin. And for wheat, as the quick rule of thumb, I guess I don't have to have the rule of thumb, and I've got the little book that's behind the pan balance scale there. Actually, I can look up, and for wheat, it's for below 14.5% moisture for long-term storage. Next slide. So, it doesn't. I don't know if you can see, but this is our very next first step. Our local seed cleaning plant it has a requirement that I can't have any fusarium, graminearium contamination in the grain the cereals that I'm going to clean there. I believe they are likely going to lift that requirement and now get to a point where they will allow up to 2%, because slowly over the past 8 to 10 years, the Canadian prairies has started to see more and more occurrence of of Fusarium. This is more from a seed quality standpoint and just an assurance within our local value chain for the seed cleaner that this is getting done to prove before I can even take it there to get it cleaned that I'm not going to risk cross-contaminating in the seed cleaning facility with my grain. So next slide. Now I'm not certain if I've cut some of that off. I put that slide there, but in any case, I'll talk to, oh no, this first one was, I only requested a certain amount to be done. So I sent this sample in to SGS Labs that's located here in Alberta, and there's labs in Saskatchewan. They may have wider ones, but I always speak with the lab coordinator directly, and this one I believe is in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. In any case, as a farmer, I've learned to test for, key things that downstream customers have asked for. Some of those historically had been grain buyers, but some of those were from farm direct sales as well. So in this analysis, I was only testing for protein, falling number, vomitoxin, and those were the key things from a wheat quality standpoint that I had been testing for. And now, after Robert's Robert's presentation, I probably am going to add Zeleny number to that as well. And I can tell from the lot number 23-PWT, kind of in the very center of the page. That's the lot number that we assign to our wheat. So it's the year, the type of wheat, what field it was grown in, and what grain bins I had it stored in. And so I know that that's my Park wheat, and Park was a variety that was developed here in Western Canada, I believe at the Lacombe Research Station in the mid 1950s. And so our farm direct customers appreciate it. Not only does it seem to have a decent baking quality, and it performs fairly well here, but a lot of our customers, farm direct customers, like the fact that it's an older variety and hasn't been subject to as aggressive plant breeding and selection processes over the last, 5 or 6 decades. Next slide, please. So here, in this most recent year, I've decided that I'm going to do more of an analysis just because I thought, well, they're offering it. You contact the lab and they say, oh, what do you want to test for? And so I'm always looking for protein and falling number and vomitoxin. But if it's all going to be included in a package, it's almost just like ordering your cable TV. Well, this is what you get with the package. And so all of this, I figure if it's for a few dollars more, if it's going to cost the same, well then sure, I'll take the package as long as it includes these key things. And so this is the same variety of Park wheat in a different year. And I was quite pleased with the results of this one because if you look at the test weight, it's nice. It's 81.6. That's the second line down. I wasn't concerned about dockage because I sent this uncleaned. So it hasn't gone to the seed cleaning plant yet. This is just as it sits in my bin, and there's 2% dockage in it that is unthreshed kernels or weed seeds or something like that. I had to look up what some of these items were. Halfway down the page, there's a MOTCG, and I said, what the heck is that? And it's material other than cereal grain. Well, of course. So that would be the percent that is my weed seeds in it, because those aren't cereal grains. So I might have wild buckwheat, wild mustard, wild oats, that sort of thing. So at first that gave me pause, but then when I found out what it was, I was not alarmed about that at all. Oh, geez, I'm already at 8 minutes. Gosh, I better hurry up. So anyway, I was very pleased. The falling number on this was 416 seconds on that one. I'll very quickly step through the next ones. This was a sample of the participatory plant breeding wheat that I had saved or had sent to Milanaise to be tested. Um, and the falling number on it was disappointingly low last year, and this was last year's crop. But we did have a burdensome year as far as moisture and lodging, and so there were concerns about it being low, but the protein was exceptional, was 14.8. But unfortunately, in my mind, that might not sell as a milling wheat if I were doing it at a large scale. Next slide, please. So this is the same variety of wheat that was my participatory plant breeding selection that I'm propagating. And I know there's lots going on here, but if we look, this is 1 year later, grown on a different field. So now the reverse is true. I've got protein that is like the second line down. My protein is only 10.5, which gave me some cause for concern. But down near the bottom, the third last line is falling number, and it was 370 seconds. So it's an example of how the same variety grown on a different field in a different season can be very different. And the whole reason I'm doing this testing, and I like, sorry, is so that I know what I have and I can have good footing to have a good conversation in the negotiation process on the sale of this grain if I'm selling it, especially larger scale to one buyer. And I do have the propensity to not have the buyer be the one who's doing the testing. I think it's just good to have an arm's length lab do the analysis, and it's fine if the buyer wants to do the testing, but I've got my own results, and if there's disparity between the two, I feel it's good assurance to just keep the conversation transparent and open if there's a difference between the buyer's test and my independent lab test. Next slide. And then from a marketing standpoint, I can't necessarily see it on my screen, but I usually like to keep a record of everything that I have in inventory. This is back from 2016 or 2017. I guess it's 2018 in the top right-hand corner. It's just a spreadsheet that I used to send to grain brokers and say, look, here's everything I have in inventory. Here's my buy it now price, the offer price, based on what I think the market would bear for items of this quality. And then it may not necessarily show, but the tabs down at the bottom, this is just an Excel spreadsheet. I would just go and take the associated lab test that I had for each of the grains that I had on offer here and put that all into the workbook. Just insert it with its own page that says hard red spring wheat lab analysis, fall rye lab analysis. And I would just email that to the entire list of grain brokers who I would be offering this to. So that was, I don't really do that anymore because we're now selling farm direct, but it was just a good way to show the buyer that I'm doing the utmost in the fullest expression of due diligence that I can in understanding what I have. Next slide. I think that's it. I don't know that I made it within 10 minutes, Sarah.
You did pretty good. Thank you. I'm so sorry to rush you.
No
That was
problem.
pretty good. So we will have Chris Wooding up next. I don't believe Chris has slides, but I have a little intro for him.
Yep. Go ahead.
Perfect. So Christopher Wooding is currently an organic farmer who grows landrace cereals in Eastern Ontario. Over the past 2 decades, Chris has taken out and independently evaluated hundreds of accessions from gene banks and has grown and bred wheat, winter, and spring, rye and barley, including population and polyculture wheats. In addition to on-farm milling, he's also the miller at Old Stone Mill, a 200-year-old grist mill in Delta, Ontario, and they're working towards climate-ready agriculture. Right, so go ahead, Chris.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. Can you hear me? Thanks for the invitation to speak. I'll going to try and address more of the philosophical ends and how I use the grain testing within the continuum of the plant breeding and the selection, and then the milling process, and then working with bakers to educate them, not whether it's good wheat or bad wheat, but what they can do with the wheat, so that it sort of takes out this commodity strain sort of mentality. Okay, so the four main things that I use that testing for is, one, choosing a variety selection. There's hundreds and hundreds, thousands of wheat varieties. We have about 260 at the farm. It takes about 7 years of bulking up before we get to the first ton that we can mill. So after year 4 or 5, when we get to sort of 100 kilograms, it's nice to get some more formal testing done and actually see which direction these wheats can go. Is it worth bulking them up that last final stage and actually getting into baking testing or milling testing or whatever. The second thing, which we really noticed, and people's falling numbers, Ward just mentioned it in his experience, epigenetically, wheat changes over time, and because we're not in the commodity variety registration system, we can save our wheat. So every year we save it, the wheat's a little bit different, and hence it's going to perform differently, and hence those lab tests should be a little bit different. And falling numbers is a classic example, and I'll have an example in a second about that. And if the falling numbers are low, everybody that you harvest that germinated last year will not grow next year. So next year, the only ones that germinate are the ones that didn't germinate last year. So you've immediately done this huge genetic shift just by saving your seed over 1 year. The other thing, especially with those glycopeak numbers that Robert mentioned, we can actually start to characterize the different varieties for bakers, and they can then say, well, this sounds like it's a good, sheeting wheat for croissants. This is a good pastry wheat. It might be a good shortbread wheat, or it's a classic sort of bread wheat. And then we can use it when bakers come to us and said, the stuff that you sold us performed this way. They call them flour failures. And as we're sharing our lab results with the bakers, and the bakers go and do their own research, one of our bakeries said that they had 0 flour failures last year because when something goes awry, they know immediately why it's going awry. Not that it's wrong, but that they're treating the flour differently than it should be. So turn that whole discussion inside out. And what I'm trying to do through these lab testing is matching our varieties to a functional use case. So taking the grain, I don't believe there's good grain and bad grain. There's lots of grain and there's lots of uses, and the lab testing can actually help us match those grains with specific shortbreads or sheeting or croissants or whatever it is. And I think that gives us a much greater access into the market by doing a farmer identified grain, a field identified grain, and a product identified grain. I mentioned this a second ago, the big difference of measuring the changes of the genome over time. And this is from climate change and flood tolerance and drought tolerance. And every time you save that grain year over year, that genomic adaptation, and Robert told me something that I didn't know, and that's the gluten and the gliadin complexes. The glutenin is genetic and the gliadin is field-based. It is climate-based. So just by definition, if we save our seeds, we have a different product year over year over year, even if it's the same variety. The other thing that I'm interested in teasing out is this variability between varieties and not by grade, because the commercial system sells by grade. If we can start characterizing varieties or classes of varieties, the group of Fife derivative wheats, and there's probably 60 wheats that were registered in Canada that are children or grandchildren or crosses with red Fife, that inheritancy will have a certain flavor complex and potentially a baking complex. And so I think we can begin to do that sort of categorizing. The other thing that the lab tests, I think, are going to show us is how our agricultural practices in terms of fungicides or soil carbon or when we plant or leaving it late harvest in the fields, how those agricultural things will actually change the quality of the grain and hence the performance of the flour. And then finally, this notion of bakers doing a back correlating, that we can grow something, breed something, and I can say, based on the lab test, I think it might be good for this. And they can go and test it and then back qualify that, yes, this correlates with that. So here's 3 or 4 examples. We did 10 grains last year, winter club wheat, Mariswigen, which is an old PPV wheat from the PPI instituted in England, Hengimo, which is a population wheat from Wales, White Fife, Flood Fife, which is one of our own flood-tolerant wheats, Turkey Red, Winter Thatcher, which is a spring Thatcher wheat from the 1930s, Iron Fife, which is a population wheat of 5 different varieties, Maslin, which has wheat, rye, barley, and oats all grown in the same field, and April Bearded, which is a classic hard spring wheat from the UK. So based on those varieties, you can see this incredibly wild variation in falling numbers, in protein matrices, in the glucopeak. So you can look across at the Hengimo one, and the bigger the number, the longer the second. So that glucopeak ABCD is 0 to 1 second, 1 to 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes. So as the minutes progress, that Hengimo is building strength all the way up to 5 minutes. But when you look at the Turkey Red and the April Bearded, they literally set up that strength within 1 or 2 minutes. So based on that sort of tactical information, a baker can say, you know, based on however they're doing the mixes, we should be able to use these flour grades for these other uses. Epigenetic recalibration. This is a beautiful example. Our winter club wheat, which came from the John Innes Center in England, never seen a Canadian winter. And it was an absolute, it wasn't an absolute disaster. It was a modest disaster. And the falling number was 62. Which means that 80% of it germinated on head. So clearly it didn't have the epigenetic triggers in the genome to go dormant, to not germinate based on a Canadian summer, a Canadian winter, day length, and all that sort of stuff. We did harvest it. We did reseed it. We got about 40% germination. And we haven't tested it this year, but it was absolutely spectacular wheat. And I have a text here from one of our bakers. And he says, quote, I just made a club wheat shortbread cookie and it was dynamite. So it's nice to see that kind of back validation, even though we don't have this year's falling numbers. But anything that we grew last year did not germinate this year. So we've literally moved that whole genome laterally. Mycotoxin is another one. All of these varieties, independent of field, independent of origin and date. Some are from the 1700s. Some of them, the latest one is 1962, the Mariswidgeon. All of them had low falling numbers for Eastern Ontario or low dawn numbers, which is vomitoxin, and it's 1 part per million is the legal limit. And all of them had it below that, and these are all no input wheats. They're all grown in field. We plant them, we harvest them. There's no fungicides. So clearly something in the agronomy and the moisture and the soil carbon is creating a soil-based culture that is managing these dawn levels. So it's interesting to begin to tease these out of what we are doing from a variety perspective and a fungicide perspective. And as a lateral note, if we spray fungicides, we're also killing some of the mycelium in the soil. And 30% of the photosynthetic sugars of the wheat plant is actually going as root exudates to feed the mycelium network. If we kill the mycelium network, we should expect a 30% bump in yield because all those sugars are going to make bigger starches, which indirectly are going to lower our protein content because protein's a relative ratio of protein to starch. You bump the starch up, the protein percentage falls. So just something simple as not using fungicides that we can measure and not get the dawn levels, we can really begin to tune our agricultural practices. Here's another really interesting one. So Iron Fife is a mixture of 4 different wheats. And we were looking at nutrient densities, and a couple of our fields chronically flood. So we were trying to measure water-soluble trace elements that would flood into a field and then precipitate out and see if that would show up in the various wheats. So we grew our Iron Fife, Red Fife, and a Thatcher, and you can see all the different nutrients, calcium, copper, phosphorus, potassium, and all of them are higher in the Iron Fife, which is a blend of 4 named varieties, versus the single variety wheats. And that tells me that there are soil mycelium networks that specialize in slightly different things or different competition networks in there. And the cumulative accumulation of these trace elements is actually higher when we have population and polyculture wheats as opposed to a single monoculture wheat. One of my favorite expressions, if it's not measured, it's not managed. And I'm beginning to think, well, or not well understood. So by measuring it, we can get insights as to what we're doing and what effects those have on the grains. Changes over time, epigenetics. One of our wheats called Flood Fife was just absolutely annihilated in 2017. We got 50 acres, 50 pounds in a 3-acre field, which was like 2 plants every square meter. And we went ahead and harvested it. And year over year, we planted it in soaking wet fields. Last year was our best harvest ever of any wheat, dry land or wetland. So clearly that flood tolerance has been inherited in the genome of the wheat, which makes it climate adaptable. And I assume you would see the same for drought resistance, lodging potentially, drought resistance. And the other thing that I'd like to start doing is back correlating with soil data, so that as we see soil organic matter and cationic exchange capacity and the ability of the soil to behave and extract and share nutrients, how that affects the wheat plant on a variety by basis or mixtures of varieties. Because clearly it's the optimum of growing the wheat to create that better kernel or kernels that will show up in the lab tests and show up in the baking. Okay, is that 8 minutes?
Amazingly. Well done. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, very much of a philosophical thing for me. I'm really just absolutely amazed at the adaptation. Those 20 weeks that we got from the UK, within 2 years, they were completely acclimatized to Southern Ontario. They were grown in the latitude of Churchill. You know, they've never seen a Canadian winter. They've never seen a foot of snow. They've never seen -30. They've never seen wind shear. And they just, converted over, and they're really, really strong Canadian winter wheats now. So really, really neat.
That's amazing to see. Really exciting to get that kind of progress. Yeah. Now we're running a bit late, so we'll have just a couple minutes for questions. I did want to show you all this slide with the list of labs where you can get these services. So it's there on the screen now. If you're interested, feel free to reach out to them. There's a variety of public and private labs, different services offered. And if you know of any that aren't on the list, please let us know. Send an email to either myself or Hugo, and we can put our addresses in the chat afterwards. And then we also have a researcher from CTAB in Quebec, Julianne Wilkinson. She's joining us on the call and just has a really cool project that we wanted to give a minute to highlight. They've been working on varietal mixtures for the past few years. So combinations of commercial varieties, which can be a really good way to increase genetic diversity on your farm. So Julianne, if you would like to share just a quick high-level summary of what you do.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I don't have a presentation to share, but I will be quick. So we did a project between 2018 and 2022 for 5 years to evaluate, like you said, the organic spring wheat varieties to do mixtures and that are adapted to our conditions, so more for the Eastern Canada. We did the project with Milanaise and with André Como, who is a retired breeder of EEAFC. And we did for all the mixtures and all the pure lines that we tested, we did the Milanaise and La Milanaise did the lab testing. So there is an abundance when you look in the literature about mixtures in different crops, wheat, rice, barley, a lot of trials and a lot of literature, but their adoption is limited. So what we tested is 2, 3, 4, and 6 variety mixture, and just if we take only the 6 component mixtures, and with the varieties that we had in the trial, we have over 2 million different possibilities of mixtures. So the possibilities are endless, and we had to test only a few possibilities. So what are the advantages for variety mixtures? It's increase the genetic diversity in one field. You're supposed to have a yield stability, which can be very relevant with the climate change. When you have unfavorable climatic situation, there is a buffer effect against all the stresses, a better use of resources, and the combination of disease resistance that will increase the potential. So the main criteria to keep in mind, the main advantage is that we use is the complementarity between the varieties. So the main challenge we have here in the province of Quebec, it's the humid conditions with a lot of rain and a high disease pressure, especially for Fusarium. But we were not lucky during the trials because we had 5 dry years. So we did not have disease pressure during the trials. So when we design a variety mixture, we should, like I said, the complementarity between the varieties is key. So what you want to do is to complement complement all the criteria that you are looking at. So you want to have grains that have a similar size, so a 1,000 kernel weight equivalent for the facility of the seeding. You want a very equivalent maturity. It's very important for the harvest and for the baking quality. You want to have a complementarity between baking qualities. Difference in height, it's not clear in the literature if it's a good or a bad thing. You want to have to choose a variety that are adapted for intercropping. You don't want to have one dominant variety that will suppress the other variety in the mix. And you want to take like different productivity and disease sensitivity. For example, you can combine a sensitive variety with a productive one, or a tolerant and less productive variety together. So what you should keep in mind is that you should be mindful with the variety mixture. And for the moment, we only tested the variety in small plots, but the next step would be to try to do varieties mixture on farms and on larger plots in the following years. So that's all for me.
Awesome. Thank you, Julianne. That is a really, really cool project.
Thank you.
And I believe Hugo has put a presentation from you in the chat as well. Does anybody have a question? We have a comment from Yvonne Chartrand that one area that's often forgotten is taste quality. It's a primordial importance for artisan bakery. It's a very good point that depending on how you want to use it and what your values are and what you're interested in, there are different traits that would be higher priority, and taste is one that often gets overlooked. And that's one of the exciting things, that you get a lot of freedom working with diverse grains as you can breed for the taste. And I believe we have a question from Chris as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to have a comment on that. Probably 7, maybe 8 years ago, I was working with Sharon Rempel, who started the Red 5 Restoration, and she and I started working on a list of words, adjectives, aromas, taste. Like we have them with whiskeys, we have them with beer, we have them with all sorts of other culinary things, but not with bread. And it would be really, really neat to start developing that bread tasting, aroma, chew, crumb taste. flavor profile complex, so that at least there's a common characterization of them, so that the two of us can compare the same bread without eating it. Just a thought.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is very subjective. Hugo?
We have another comment from André Como, who says, asking Yvon, tell me about a variety that you think tastes better than others. I don't know if Chris and Ward, you have your 2 cents on better flavored varieties out there.
That's a true question. I think certainly the red springs have the best flavor. The white winters have reasonable flavor and are better baking, but I really believe that the better the flavor of the wheat comes back to the soil and the soil profile and the soil organic matter. Because ultimately that's where those trace elements which are in the organic proteins, which gives us the aromatics, and I mean sulfur is an absolute key one. And if there's no sulfur in the soil, then a lot of the aromas aren't there, and the aroma is the very first thing that you smell just before you taste it. So
Yeah, I would chime in and agree that the soil is very likely as much of a contributor, or maybe it's not the only thing, but it's probably the most volatile, and it's not one that we can control. So as you saw with I had the same variety in 2 different fields from 2 different years with dramatically different protein and falling number. So too would it be with the phytonutrients that it is picking up with the mycelium network and the entire microbial community that is doing that free enterprise exchange for carbohydrates. It really is beyond our control, and I almost have like an agnostic version or perception where it's like, hey, there's something going on there, and I truly think it's beyond human capacity to fully understand what's going on. And because of that, it's uncontrolled, and I have the benefit of having a baker dedicated really in a relationship with me that I can go to and say, okay, here's my new PPB wheat, which is yet to occur once I get it cleaned at the seed plant. I'm going to go to him before I continue to grow this any further and bulk it up. If his report back is, wow, that doesn't taste very good, I'm probably going to stop propagating that wheat. I'm probably going to move to or not try it as aggressively in growing it. So thanks.
And with that, thank you all so much for joining us. This was an intro today, but hopefully you've all learned something and have some new insights on how this end-use quality testing could be a tool for you. And thank you so much to each of our speakers for taking the time to join.